The sun had barely risen, casting a soft golden glow across the sleepy suburban streets. Officer Jake Reynolds slid into the driver's seat of his patrol car, a sense of routine settling in as he glanced over at his canine partner, Max. Max, a powerful German shepherd with eyes that could pierce through any darkness, sat alert beside him. The two had been partners for years, a seamless team. Max's keen instincts and Jake's steady hand had made them a trusted duo on the force. It was the start of another shift, and as always, they were ready for whatever the day would throw their way. Max let out a quiet huff, his nose twitching as if sensing something in the air. Jake chuckled lightly. "You're always on edge, aren't you, buddy?" He scratched behind Max's ears, a silent understanding passing between them. It was as if Max knew the streets better than anyone, his instincts sharper than most officers. The radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. "Unit 5, we've got a possible drug bust in progress at 3rd and Oak. Suspects are believed to be armed and dangerous. Proceed with caution." Jake's eyes narrowed. A routine drug bust. Nothing they couldn't handle. They had dealt with dangerous situations before. Max's ears perked up at the sound of the call. Jake felt a small thrill of anticipation. He wasn't nervous, but the hair on the back of his neck stood up. It had been a while since they'd faced something that would truly test their skills. This could be the one. "Let's go, Max," Jake muttered as he turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and the car sped down the quiet streets, the flashing lights casting brief shadows on the passing houses. The neighborhood appeared peaceful, almost idyllic. Families were just beginning to stir, kids running out to catch the school bus. But Jake knew better. Beneath that peaceful exterior, trouble often lurked, and today it had found its way to 3rd and Oak. As they neared the location, Jake's senses heightened. The street was lined with modest houses, the kind of place where most people would never expect anything criminal to happen. But it wasn't the first time a quiet neighborhood had been used as a front for something more dangerous. He slowed down, scanning the area for any signs of trouble. Max's low growl drew Jake's attention. The dog was tense, his body stiff, and his nose pressed to the air, sniffing for any scent that might give away the presence of danger. Jake watched his partner closely, sensing that something was off. Max was rarely this alert unless there was something he couldn't quite put his paw on. They parked a few houses down from the target address, the plan being to approach the house discreetly, a method they'd used successfully countless times before. But this time, as Jake stepped out of the patrol car, something felt different. It wasn't the stillness of the morning or the quiet streets. No, this time, it was a deeper instinct, one that told him things might not go as planned. Max's ears stood at attention. Jake gave him a nod, and together, they began to walk toward the house, unaware that in the seconds to come, their world was about to be turned upside down. The closer Jake and Max got to the house, the more Jake could feel his instincts kicking in. He knew something wasn't right. The usual morning calm was disturbed by the faintest sense of tension in the air. Max's behavior confirmed it. The dog's body language was telling him everything. His posture was alert, his ears cocked forward, and he was moving with a quiet, deliberate confidence that signaled he sensed something dangerous. Jake glanced at Max, giving him a reassuring pat on the side. "Stay sharp, buddy," he whispered under his breath, more to himself than to Max. They approached the house with caution, each step calculated. The street was eerily quiet, the usual background noise of suburban life muted as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. There were no kids playing in their yards, no sounds of cars passing. Just silence. They reached the front yard of the house, a small, well-kept property with an overgrown hedge and a sagging front porch. It looked unremarkable, too ordinary for the kind of trouble they were expecting. Jake gave the house one last once-over before signaling to Max to move closer. Max's low growl was the only sound that broke the silence. The dog was alert, eyes locked on the door. Something was off. Jake's fingers tightened around the grip of his sidearm, though he hadn't drawn it yet. He wasn't sure why, but he could feel the tension building in his chest. It was as though the calm before the storm was growing thicker with each passing second. Jake motioned for Max to stay as he cautiously moved to the side of the house, taking a brief moment to peer around the corner. A car was parked in the driveway, a nondescript sedan that looked out of place. But Jake couldn't put his finger on why. There was something about it that felt wrong. As he crouched down to check the windows, the door to the house creaked open. Jake froze. A figure appeared in the doorway, just a shadow against the dim light inside. He couldn't make out the person's face, but the figure's posture was defensive, their movements quick and calculated. Jake's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. There was supposed to be no one inside, just a quick search and an easy arrest. Instead, they had stumbled right into the heart of a dangerous situation. Before Jake could react, there was a flash of movement. The figure inside the doorway quickly disappeared, and just as fast, the sharp crack of a gunshot rang out, echoing through the street. Jake's heart raced as he dove behind the nearest cover, a thick bush on the side of the house. Max sprang into action without hesitation, lunging toward the door, barking fiercely, but it was too late. A second shot rang out, and the sound of glass shattering followed. Jake cursed under his breath, instinctively reaching for his radio, but it was dead. The battery drained just hours before their shift. They were on their own. Max continued barking, but Jake knew they couldn't stay in the open for much longer. The gunfire had shattered the false sense of calm, and now every second counted. Inside the house, there were movements, more figures, shifting and preparing for something. Jake's mind raced as he tried to make sense of it all. He hadn't expected a fight, especially not one this violent. But now it was clear. This wasn't just a routine bust. They had walked right into an ambush. The door to the house opened again, and more figures emerged, armed and ready. Jake's pulse quickened. He was seconds away from being caught in a deadly firefight, and the only thing standing between him and certain death was his canine partner, Max. The storm was no longer coming. It had already arrived. Jake's mind raced as he scrambled to assess the situation. The first gunshot had shattered the morning's peace, and now he was under fire. Max, still barking fiercely, was caught in the open, but Jake couldn't risk getting up to reposition him. His heart was pounding in his chest, and his thoughts were clouded by the overwhelming rush of adrenaline. He could hear the sound of shuffling footsteps approaching from inside the house, but all he could focus on was keeping himself and Max safe. The last thing he wanted was to become a target. From behind the bush, Jake peered out cautiously, his eyes scanning the area. The house was now filled with hostile figures. He could see two men standing near the door, weapons drawn, their eyes darting in every direction. One of them was holding a rifle, the other a handgun. Neither appeared to notice Jake's position yet, but he knew it was only a matter of time before they did. Every moment felt like a countdown to something worse. Max was still barking, the sound of his aggressive growls cutting through the tension in the air. Jake's instinct told him that the K-9 knew something they didn't, that the situation had gone beyond just an arrest and was quickly spiraling into a life-or-death fight. Jake's hand gripped his radio, hoping it might still work, but the static was deafening. He slammed it against his palm, frustrated. His backup wouldn't hear them, and they were far too vulnerable to make any move without reinforcement. He quickly checked his sidearm. His weapon was functional, but Jake wasn't sure he could make a clean shot from his position behind the bush. There was no way he was getting out of this quietly. He needed a plan. The suspects hadn't seen him yet, but Max had already given them plenty of reason to be cautious. Jake's eyes darted toward the back of the house. There was an alleyway that led to a neighboring property, a potential escape route, but it would be risky. With a few quick, controlled breaths, Jake assessed his best options. His gun was still holstered. He couldn't risk drawing it just yet, not without the element of surprise. Max, his ever-loyal partner, seemed to sense that something was coming. The dog's movements became more calculated. Max's posture shifted, his focus entirely on the door, waiting for a command. Jake gave him a subtle nod, signaling him to stay low and remain quiet for a moment. As he shifted his weight slightly, a soft creak came from the floorboards of the house, and then another shot rang out. This time, the bullet zipped past Jake's head, so close he could feel the rush of air. His heart stopped. This was it. This was the moment where everything could change. The suspects were closing in. They knew he was there, and they were coming for him. Jake had no choice now but to act. With a swift movement, he drew his weapon, emerging from behind the bush just as another shot rang out, this time aiming directly for him. He dove toward the side of the house, using his body to shield himself from the incoming fire. He could hear the sound of boots hitting the gravel as the suspects rushed to surround him. Max was right behind him, never leaving his side, barking and lunging at the nearest suspect, throwing them off balance just long enough for Jake to get to cover. The world around Jake became a blur of gunfire, chaos, and urgency. Every second felt like an eternity, but Jake wasn't about to go down without a fight. He knew Max was with him, and that was the only thing keeping him grounded in the madness of the moment. As the fire continued, Jake's mind raced through the drills they practiced, keeping low, staying out of sight, using Max as his shield when necessary. The K9 partner was a relentless force, charging toward the enemy, determined to protect his handler no matter the cost. But even with Max's courage, Jake knew they were outgunned. The odds were quickly stacking against them. His hand was shaking, his grip on his weapon tightening, but Jake had only one goal now: survive. The enemy was closing in fast, and every breath was a struggle. But just as the situation seemed to spiral out of control, Jake realized that the one thing that might save him was the same thing that had gotten him this far: his partnership with Max. The world around Jake had descended into chaos. Gunshots rang out from all directions, and the ground beneath him seemed to shake with every new explosion of sound. His heart pounded in his ears, drowning out everything except the immediate threat. He could hear the desperate, panicked shouts of the suspects, the slap of boots on concrete as they moved to surround him. He was cornered, the walls closing in, and yet, amidst the madness, he felt a sense of calm, a strange stillness that came from the one constant in his life: Max. The K9 was right beside him, teeth bared, a powerful growl rumbling from deep within his chest. Max's entire body was tense, his muscles coiled, ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. Jake could see the raw determination in his eyes, the same determination that had carried them both through countless dangerous situations. It was that bond, that unwavering loyalty, that had made them an unstoppable team. Max was more than just a partner. He was Jake's protector, his friend. In the chaos of the gunfire, Max reacted without hesitation. Without warning, he surged forward, his speed and strength making him a blur. The first suspect he charged at was caught completely off guard. The man barely had time to react before Max was on him, knocking him to the ground with a powerful, well-timed lunge. The gun the suspect had been holding went flying out of his hand as he tumbled onto the pavement, and Max immediately moved to restrain him, his powerful jaws clamping down on the man's arm, pinning him in place. Jake didn't have time to process it all, but he knew this was his chance. The momentary distraction that Max had caused gave Jake a split second of freedom. He took the opportunity, diving forward and using the cover of a nearby dumpster to reposition himself. His gun was still in hand, but his focus wasn't on firing just yet. Instead, he scanned the area for any other threats, moving with a calculated precision that came from years of experience. Max had bought him the time he needed. But Jake wasn't the only one who was using the distraction to his advantage. Max, still holding the suspect in place, growled as he shifted, scanning the other figures emerging from the house. One of the suspects had tried to circle around to Jake's position, but Max was too quick. The K9 lunged once more, this time barreling into the man with a force that knocked him off his feet. The man's weapon flew from his grasp, skidding across the gravel. Jake couldn't believe it. Max wasn't just protecting him, he was fighting back. The K9's movements were fluid and precise, a calculated series of attacks that kept the suspects on the defensive. Max had become the distraction, the force that broke the suspect's concentration, buying Jake the precious seconds he needed to stay alive. For a brief moment, Jake allowed himself to take in the sight. Max was a blur of movement, his jaws snapping at anyone who came too close, his body a wall of muscle and determination. The dog was in full control, refusing to let anyone harm his handler. It was as if Max was fighting for both their lives, doing whatever it took to ensure they made it out of this alive. But then, as quickly as it began, the situation shifted. One of the suspects managed to regain control of his weapon. He raised the gun, aiming it directly at Max. Jake's heart stopped. There was no time to think, no time to aim. He acted on instinct alone, raising his own weapon and firing 2 quick shots. The first bullet missed, but the second found its mark. The man crumpled to the ground, dropping the gun from his hand. Max, unfazed by the chaos, immediately turned back to Jake, his eyes locked on his handler. The dog's body language was clear. "Stay close. We're not done yet." It was a look Jake knew all too well. Max had saved him, again, but the fight was far from over. With a sense of renewed urgency, Jake moved quickly, pulling Max closer to him. They weren't out of danger yet, but with Max by his side, Jake knew they had a fighting chance. Their bond had kept them alive so far, and as the chaos continued around them, Jake clung to the one certainty he had. They weren't giving up. The air was thick with tension, the sound of gunfire still echoing in Jake's ears as he tried to regain his bearings. His heart was pounding in his chest, and every breath felt like it was coming too fast, too shallow. Max, ever loyal, was standing guard beside him, his body tense, his eyes never leaving the remaining threats. The K9 had already done the impossible, but now they were far from safe. Jake took a quick inventory of the situation. The 2 suspects that Max had subdued were still alive but incapacitated, their weapons scattered on the ground, but there were more. He could hear footsteps echoing through the yard, the sounds of shuffling feet from inside the house. It was clear now that the ambush wasn't just a random drug bust gone wrong. This was something much bigger, and there was no telling how many more were inside that house. His side was aching from where he'd taken a grazing shot earlier, and the blood seeping from his wound made his movements sluggish. His vision was starting to blur around the edges, but Jake refused to let the pain slow him down. He had one goal now, to stay alive long enough to get out of this situation. He couldn't die here. Not today. Max's growl cut through the air, pulling Jake back to the present. The K9's ears were alert, his body stiff. They both knew what was coming. More enemies. The suspects weren't finished yet. The sound of doors opening inside the house reached Jake's ears, and he could tell they were closing in on their position. Jake's fingers tightened around his sidearm. His gun was still his best chance, but the odds were stacked against him. Max looked up at him, sensing the moment of danger. Jake could see the understanding in his eyes. It was like Max knew that every second mattered, that they were running out of time. Then, just as Jake prepared to move, he heard it, the sound of more footsteps, this time approaching rapidly. The threat was closing in faster than he could have imagined. There was nowhere left to hide. The house was surrounded, and the alleyway to the side had already been cut off. There was only one option left. Jake's mind raced. There was no backup yet, no help. They were on their own. And then it happened. The unmistakable sound of a car engine roaring down the street. It was too far to be of any immediate help, but the noise gave Jake a brief moment of hope, a thread of possibility that he clung to. His radio had been useless, but maybe the cavalry was on its way. Maybe he wasn't alone after all. Max barked again, this time more urgently. It was as if the K9 was trying to tell Jake to act, and act fast. Suddenly, everything felt like it was happening in slow motion. Jake's heart hammered in his chest. The door of the house burst open, and 3 men emerged, guns raised. They were heavily armed, their faces hardened with malice. There was no negotiating now. They meant business, and they weren't going to stop until they had Jake, or worse, Max. Jake had no time to think. His instincts kicked in, and he moved. Max leaped forward, teeth bared, charging at the first man in his path. The suspect barely had time to react before Max tackled him to the ground with a force that left the man breathless. Jake didn't hesitate. He opened fire, the sound of his shots blending with the bark of Max's growls. Two men dropped to the ground, incapacitated, their weapons useless. But the third remained. Jake's vision blurred again, the world spinning in and out of focus, but his grip on the gun was steady. He had one last shot, one final chance to survive. The third man took a step toward him, raising his weapon. Then, everything seemed to stop. Max, with the unrelenting focus only a K9 could possess, sprang forward once again, charging at the last suspect with a savage intensity. It was like the world had slowed down, the air thick with anticipation. Max leaped, his powerful body crashing into the man, knocking him off balance. The suspect's gun went flying, and in the same instant, Jake took his shot. The bullet hit its mark. Max had saved him again, but there was no time to celebrate. They were far from out of danger. The backup was still on its way, but until then, Jake and Max had to rely on each other to make it through. Seconds from death, Jake knew that if it hadn't been for his K9 partner, this would have been the end. But Max wasn't about to let that happen. They weren't done yet, and together, they would fight until the very last breath. The world around Jake was a blur of flashing lights, the constant ringing in his ears from the gunshots, and the desperate sound of his own breathing as he fought to stay conscious. The third suspect was down, but Jake wasn't out of the woods yet. His side throbbed with pain where the bullet had grazed him, and he could feel the blood beginning to seep through his uniform, pooling in his boot. His head was dizzy, and the adrenaline that had been keeping him upright was starting to wear thin. Every movement felt like a battle, but he knew there was no time to rest. They weren't safe yet. Max was still at his side, ever vigilant, his head swiveling to watch for any new threats. The K9 had kept them alive this long, and Jake knew he couldn't rely on his own strength alone to make it out of this. He needed his partner now more than ever. But the noise was starting to grow. The sound of distant sirens was growing louder, but it wasn't enough. They needed to get out, and they needed to do it now before more of the suspects could regroup. Jake's fingers tightened around his weapon, his body aching with each movement as he tried to rise from behind the dumpster. Every instinct screamed at him to stay low, to find cover, but his mind was racing ahead. The alleyway, that was their escape route. It was the only option they had left. He gave Max a sharp look, a silent command. The dog was already ahead of him, bounding toward the narrow alley that ran behind the house, his eyes darting between every shadow as if he could see through the darkness itself. Max was always the first to take action, always the one to lead when things got tough. Jake trusted him with his life, and now was no different. Max was halfway down the alley before Jake even realized it, and despite his own pain, he followed, stumbling slightly as he pushed himself to his feet. His vision was still blurry, his thoughts disjointed, but Max's presence was the only clarity he needed. The K9 never faltered, never hesitated. It was as though Max knew exactly what to do, just like always. The alley was narrow, cluttered with discarded garbage bins and old wooden fences. It wasn't the perfect escape route, but it was better than staying in the open. As they moved deeper into the alley, Jake heard the unmistakable sound of approaching footsteps from behind. The remaining suspects were closing in on them, and they weren't going to let them go without a fight. Max growled again, his fur bristling as he stopped to listen. Jake could hear the footsteps now, too. They were fast, determined, but the alley was their advantage. Max was already circling around, positioning himself in front of Jake like a shield. "Stay with me, Max," Jake muttered, his voice strained. The K9 was ready to defend, but Jake wasn't sure how much longer he could last. His wound was slowing him down, and he could feel his energy draining with each step. Max was still at his side, but Jake knew they were running out of time. Suddenly, the sound of sirens grew closer. The cavalry was almost there, but the question was whether they would make it in time. The suspects were nearly on them. Jake pushed forward, refusing to stop. They couldn't stay here. They had to move, and they had to move fast. With one last burst of effort, he urged Max ahead. The K9 responded immediately, leading the way, his speed unmatched as he sprinted toward the next corner of the alley. the sound of his paws pounding on the pavement a constant reassurance to Jake that they weren't alone in this fight. They reached the corner of the alley, and just as Jake was about to turn, the unmistakable sound of a gunshot rang out, barely missing Max by inches. Jake dove forward, pulling Max down with him behind a stack of boxes. "Stay down, buddy," Jake whispered, his voice hoarse, though his determination remained unwavering. Max, ever the protector, stayed low beside him, his body tense and ready to spring into action. They were cornered, but the sirens were almost upon them. Jake knew they couldn't hold out much longer, but as long as he had Max by his side, he knew they'd keep fighting. Then in the distance, Jake saw it, a police cruiser speeding toward the alleyway, its lights flashing. Relief flooded through him, but it was short-lived. The fight wasn't over yet. "Hold on, Max," Jake muttered, gritting his teeth through the pain. "Help's almost here." But in that moment, he knew that getting to the police car wouldn't be easy. The danger wasn't over yet. The last few seconds of their escape would be the hardest of all, and Jake wasn't sure they could make it out alive without one last desperate push. The police sirens were growing louder, but Jake knew better than to think help was already there. The sound of the approaching cruiser was a beacon of hope, but also a countdown. The remaining suspects were closing in, and it wouldn't take them long to realize the help was almost on top of them. Jake's body was screaming for rest, the blood loss from his wound making him lightheaded, but he didn't have time to slow down. Max was by his side, every bit as determined as he had been from the start, but even Max couldn't hold off a full assault forever. Jake's grip on his gun tightened, his finger brushing against the trigger. There was no time for hesitation. There was no time for second-guessing. They had to fight through this final stretch to reach the police car and escape before it was too late. Max's ears perked up, and he gave a low growl, warning Jake that they were running out of time. The K9 was already low to the ground, his muscles coiled and ready for action. Jake couldn't afford to waste a second. They had to make a break for it. Now. "Go, Max," Jake barked. Max was gone in an instant, sprinting toward the far end of the alley, his body a blur of motion. Jake pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the pain in his side as he staggered forward after him. Every step felt like a battle, but Max's speed and determination kept Jake going. He had no choice now. If he didn't keep up with the K9, they'd both be sitting ducks. As they neared the end of the alley, Jake could hear the men chasing them, their footsteps pounding louder and faster with every passing second. He turned just in time to see one of the suspects rounding the corner, his weapon raised, aiming straight at them. Without thinking, Jake dropped to the ground, taking cover behind a stack of crates. Max, ever loyal, was already on top of the suspect, leaping at him with a ferocity that only a K9 could manage. The man tried to raise his weapon, but Max knocked him down with a powerful shove, sending the gun skidding out of reach. The suspect was momentarily stunned, but it wasn't enough. The other two suspects had caught up, and now they were closing in from both sides. Jake's heart was racing. His pulse was so loud he could barely hear the world around him. It was just him and Max against three men who were intent on finishing what they had started. Max had saved him more times than Jake could count, but they were outnumbered, and Jake knew they couldn't hold out for much longer. The sound of the approaching police cruiser grew even louder now. Jake could see the headlights piercing the darkness at the end of the alley, but they weren't there yet. There was still a gap between them and the help they so desperately needed. With no other option left, Jake made a split-second decision. He fired two quick shots, the sound of his gunshots breaking the silence of the alley. One man dropped to the ground, a shot to the leg immobilizing him, but the other remained standing, his gun trained on Jake. Max, ever the warrior, was still on top of the first suspect, refusing to let go. The K9's jaws were clamped firmly around the man's arm, preventing him from reaching for his weapon. Max was not letting go until the threat was neutralized. Jake turned to face the final suspect. The man was just a few feet away, his eyes wide with panic as he saw the police cruiser finally appear, its lights flashing brightly in the distance. He hesitated for a split second, long enough for Jake to take the shot. The man crumpled to the ground, and Jake immediately felt the tension release from his body. The last threat was down, but they weren't safe yet. Max was still fighting, holding the remaining suspect at bay. Jake's legs were shaking, his strength fading fast, but he knew that every second counted now. The police cruiser was almost upon them. He just needed to make it to the car. With a final push, Jake crawled toward Max, pulling himself up with what little strength he had left. "Good boy, Max," Jake muttered, his voice barely a whisper. Max looked back at him, his eyes full of determination, and with a final growl, released the last suspect, allowing Jake to make his way toward the cruiser. The door of the police car flew open just as Jake reached it. Two officers jumped out, guns raised, and immediately took control of the scene. Max, panting heavily, trotted up to Jake's side, resting his head against his handler's leg. Jake looked down at him, grateful beyond words. "We made it, Max," Jake whispered. "We made it." The sirens were now deafening, the backup in full force. The battle was over. They had survived. But Jake knew one thing for sure. None of this would have been possible without Max. The K9 wasn't just a partner. He was a hero. And Jake was alive today because of him. The chaos had finally come to an end. The remaining suspects were secured, handcuffed, and taken away by backup officers who had flooded the alley in full force. The sound of sirens faded, and the flashing lights began to dim as the scene slowly came under control. But for Jake, the noise, the adrenaline, and the danger didn't quite fade as quickly. His heart was still racing, and his breath came in shallow gasps as the last remnants of the attack echoed in his mind. He leaned against the side of the police cruiser, his hand gripping the door for support, while Max stood beside him, his head lowered, breathing heavily but remaining ever vigilant. Jake's side ached with the wound, the sharp pain now a constant reminder of just how close he had come to losing everything. The bullet had only grazed him, but it didn't feel like a mere scratch. It felt like a warning, a brush with death that he couldn't ignore. But he wasn't alone in this. Not by a long shot. He turned his head slowly to look at Max, the K9's intense gaze meeting his. Max's fur was matted with dirt and blood. The fight had taken its toll on the loyal dog, but he was still standing strong. His tail wagged weakly, the motion slow but filled with pride. Max had saved him. Over and over again. In the moments when Jake's life had been hanging in the balance, Max had been there, every step of the way. "Good boy," Jake said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. Max looked up at him with that unshakable loyalty in his eyes, as if to say that the danger was over and it was time to rest, time to be together. Safe. Officers began to approach, offering Jake quick words of congratulations, praise, and concern for his injury. But Jake barely registered it. His thoughts were still on Max, still on the bond they shared. It wasn't just the heroic acts that made Max special. It was their connection, the silent understanding between them that had saved their lives more times than Jake could count. One of the officers asked Jake if he needed medical attention. He nodded, finally acknowledging the sharp pain from his side. A paramedic approached, quickly assessing the situation, but Jake couldn't tear his gaze from Max. The K9 remained at his side, as he always had, unwavering. "They'll take care of you," the paramedic said, motioning for Jake to sit down on the curb as she carefully examined his wound. Jake didn't resist. His body was finally giving in to exhaustion, his muscles sore, his mind foggy. But the moment he sat down, Max's head nudged into his lap, offering his usual comforting presence. Jake looked down at the dog, rubbing his head gently. "You're the best partner I could ever ask for, Max," Jake said softly, his words carrying more weight than any of the officer's praises. Max's tail wagged slightly, his eyes still locked on his handler, as if to say he'd do it all over again in a heartbeat. The paramedics tended to Jake's wound, cleaning it up and bandaging it, but his focus was entirely on Max. He knew there would be plenty of time for the doctors and for the debrief, but the real bond, the one that had kept them both alive through the worst of it, was between him and Max, and that bond was unbreakable. As the adrenaline of the situation wore off, Jake realized something that had been true all along. Max wasn't just his K9 partner. He was his protector, his friend, his family. Together, they had made it through a deadly ambush, a firefight, and the chaos of it all. But it was more than just the physical dangers. It was the emotional strength they gave each other, the trust and reliance that went beyond words. As the paramedics finished up and the officers began to wrap up the scene, Jake stood up, still a bit unsteady but determined. He patted Max gently on the back, a silent thanks for everything that K9 had done. Max responded with a soft, happy bark, his tail wagging with excitement at the mere fact that they had made it through. "We're good, Max. We're going home," Jake said, his voice filled with gratitude and affection. Max gave a small bark, as if to agree. The two of them walked toward the squad car, side by side, a perfect team, ready to face whatever the next day would bring. But for now, they had survived, and that was all that mattered. Together, they were unstoppable.